So I'm here in this case because I'm going to give a plug for New Labor Forum. The latest issue, I have a piece in here called "The Time Has Come for Sectoral Bargaining," and Paula, who recruited me to write that, also recruited me to be here. And so if that subject's a little bit tedious, hopefully I can wade in the water a little bit and also relate it to the common good. And then Marissa's going to get us focused on New York City and what everyone in this room can actually do. So, so why focus, at a time like this on something like sectoral bargaining? Even the name makes me sort of get drowsy. And for me, and almost the whole time I've been active in CWA, is also doing what I'd call community organizing through the union. And Arthur was part of that journey for many of those decades, if not all, probably all. And so this notion of common good, whether it's public sector where it's sort of obvious, it's like if you don't bargain for the common good in the public sector, who's going to be on your side? Good luck, is what I would say. Even though, we have to still learn those lessons, and I think that was great. But as Marilyn said, in every single case you have to do a version of that. The big strike we had that was famous 20 years ago here was healthcare for all, no cuts at 9X. Now nobody even knows what 9X is anymore, but it used to be the main, it's now Verizon, so we'll make that simple and move on. But in terms of these few minutes and this article that I wrote on sectoral bargaining, so that comes out of sort of a lot of pain, as Lauren was talking about. I was a founding chair of Jobs with Justice 32 years ago. I was young then, by the way. And many other similar kinds of things, including our revolution coming out of the Bernie Sanders campaign. I said to Bernie at the very beginning, my term had just ended as CWA president, and I had said to our stewards, I'm back in the streets. I have a decent pension, 39 years. And I said to Bernie, it's great that you're running for president. I'm interested in building a movement. And at the time, he said, he wouldn't say this now. He put his hand on my arm. He said, Larry, I know I'm not going to be president. We're doing this to build a movement. Now, he changed his mind about that a few months later, and to this day would never say that. But for me, that was about building a movement. Our revolution is a piece of that movement. And I say this only quickly at the beginning here because, where I'm coming from is that, number one, we have to build a mass movement. It has to be explicitly political. Every piece doesn't have to be political. But the mass movement of what I call 50 million or more people, that's really where we have to aim higher, has to explicitly be, we're going to fight for political power, racial justice, economic power, parts of that. But second, that we get politically in this country, we are all candidate addicted, and I mean addicted like heroin. We wait for the next candidate at every level, and then we celebrate on the left. So-and-so just won, and this one won. And this goes for Bernie. If he was sitting here, he'd hear this. He's heard the same speech from me. We're candidate addicted. The rules matter. The rules matter. And as you heard from Marilyn, CWA, we have Committee for Better Banks. Arthur's heard all of this because he chairs the committee that funds a lot of these things. We have a rank and file committee. These new things called growth have to go through this elected committee that he chairs. And, a lot of people say, Committee for Better Banks, it's crazy, you're never going to get bank workers to do anything in this country. So at the same, or the Verizon Wireless campaign, which is 20 years. So one of our things is, as long as the workers fight, we fight with them. It's not about winning necessarily, it's about building something that adds up to something. But the rules matter. Whether it's the political revolution, as I would call it, whether it's the Kavanaugh shit show, the rules matter. We look at the outcome, we look at the issue, and yeah, that's where we get our energy. That's where our fire comes from. Energy from unlikely sources, what brings us here today. I'm going to come back to teacher strikes in West Virginia. Key part of shaping what I call sectoral bargaining, what the rest of the world calls sectoral bargaining, but how you get there for us. It is a mass movement. It's not just come up with a new bureaucratic form. Those fights lead to the ability to have different rules. But overall, our politics We suffer from literally the worst rules of any democracy. We never talk about it. I just spent 2 years, people thought I was crazy, vice chair of the Union Reform Commission of the Democratic Party. And I'll offend you all. You have the worst Democratic Party in the country by far in New York. It is not a close call. It is not democratic. It is rigged. It is a disgrace. And get this, in those 2 years, 21 people were on this thing, and we ended up changing most of the rules of how a president gets nominated. Doesn't change the rule of how a governor gets nominated in this state or anybody else. It doesn't change the rules about how Crowley can go into a diner in Queens, where Arthur lives, and get elected again, chair of the Democratic Party of Queens with 10 people in the room. These are rules. It's not just who runs for office. It's not just, are you ready to work your heart out as a bank worker and get fired because we're going to organize in the streets. We also have to change the rules. We have to understand what rules work in the world and not just say, which I'm very prone to, let's hit the streets, it's mass organizing, it's spontaneity. I love that, honestly, my entire life. Growing up in Philadelphia as a kid, fighting Frank Rizzo. Most people here don't know who that was. But, yeah, well, anyway, I'm not getting into that. I only had 15 minutes total. But afterwards. So the rules. So that's how I come to this article and this work. So there's a lot of work going on now where a bunch of us are trying to promote a real discussion about sectoral bargaining. And again, there's other things that come into this, but we don't have the minutes for that right this minute. And it comes for me from a number of places. So one of the good things about the CWA work was almost all good things, but was getting to work across borders in a global way in very concrete ways, like 18 years to build an organizing at T-Mobile, which is still, these workers are still, I mean, we've hardly gotten anywhere on that, to be honest, except people have learned a lot and workers are in that fight. The only thing organized in T-Mobile is one store in Harlem, in the entire country, in terms of traditional organizing. And that's 18 years, and that's the largest union in the world, Verdi, the services union of Germany, as the partner for CWA in that fight. 18 years of that fight. The bank workers is probably 8 years short for us. But in the course of that, what happens? We have this partnership with Verdi that's grassroots, call center workers there, call center workers here. But also, for me, I get to learn a lot about how does bargaining work in Germany. Verdi, 2 million members. It's the main service sector union in Germany, by far. In most of those sectors, all the employers in that sector have to bargain with whatever the unions are. Now, they don't bargain everything. There's still a lot of stuff at the workplace level. But the bigger things, that's how they're bargained. And it's not just Germany. It's not just the Nordic countries, which is where this model is the strongest. Think about South Africa. Many of us were involved in the fight against apartheid. The ANC, after smashing apartheid, in their sort of first 100 days, one of the key things they did is establish sectoral minimum wages and sectoral bargaining, 36 sectors in the case of South Africa. So they had the chance there. They had total power at that time. And there's a lot of issues in between now and then. I get it. But the point is, they had real power then and could do anything. They didn't go to what we have, which is hard to even describe to anybody else. Enterprise by, we're talking the private sector now, enterprise by enterprise, no federal sector bargaining, and yet federal workers accept it. It's the only country in the world practically where there's not collective bargaining in the federal sector. But anyway, back to the private sector, and half the states, no public sector bargaining now. No, in South Africa, they looked at the Nordic countries in Europe. They looked at Brazil and Argentina. Chile used to have sectoral bargaining. The United States and U.S. economists, after the coup that we helped engineer, one of the first things they did is get rid of sectoral bargaining in Chile. And so the rules matter. It's not just about finding, as important as it is, and that is where our energy comes from, new ways to organize no matter what. Resistant movements have been built in way worse conditions than what any of us face. Any of us. The worst, the most oppressed of us here. Like the South Africa story, what it was like to be in that ANC for forever, for its entire existence. We don't face that, and many other examples. But the rules matter. It's not just mass organizing, massive organizing, mass organizing. So global north, all of Europe, even in Canada, the education sector is by province. South America, Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil. Bank workers, you know who got us into the bank worker organizing in CWA? The finance workers of Brazil from Sao Paulo. They actually funded, not that we didn't put in funds, but they funded it in a big way. The initial Committee for Better Banks work here. They put in about $100,000 from their, why? Because in Sao Paulo, they had all these New York banks at the bargaining table with them, sectoral bargaining, all the banks, the Brazilian banks, the Spanish banks, the US banks, and the Bank Workers Union. And they had the ability to fight too. It wasn't just on paper, it wasn't just bureaucracy. What was the outcome from that? The wages and standard of living of bank workers in Sao Paulo, including now with the crisis they're in politically, much higher than anywhere in the United States. And they have real power. And it's the same banks. So when the rules are one way, Brazil, these banks operate one way. When the rules are what they are here, which they will now fund and fight to keep the way they are or worse, they operate totally differently. Same CEOs. Energy. So lots of us know a lot about West Virginia, the whole movement called Red for Ed. But what's the main takeaway from that? Again, it's in the article. Main takeaway from that should be that, number one, mass organizing. Teachers organized, 2 unions involved, but frankly, they organized across the union structure and without the union structure. 55 counties. The T-shirt, which I should have worn today had I thought of it. 55 counties altogether. That was their T-shirt, 55 altogether. Common good. Communities, students were in it in all 55 counties. When those teachers were on strike, they fed the kids because in many of those counties, it was the only decent food those kids got. Common good. In their bones that it was about the common good. And they were able to bargain with that governor. And this is a great example that's hard to reproduce. Stuff that in New Jersey, where I spent 20 years, that's where my CWA life is totally, or was. You can't bargain classroom size. You can't bargain health care, thanks to the Democratic legislature that collaborated with Chris Christie. We used to be able to bargain health care. They made that deal. Health care is off the table. You can't we could go on and on about what you can't do. Taylor law, strike 1 day, you're fined 2 days. West Virginia, no bargaining law, let the shit hit the fan. And if you're unified, and if you have the community on your side, you can bargain at that level. That's the sectoral level. In Canada, by law, I think in every province, don't hold me to that, but in virtually every province in Canada. Not school district by school district or school board by school board, but the whole province of Canada. That's the model that's working in the world for the most part. But it's not just about the model. I don't want to become a structuralist here. Yeah, the rules matter, structures matter. It's the linkage between building the kind of political movement that can win demands like this, aiming high enough so that if we do win, we actually do transform things. Many of us here, me in particular, heavily involved in the Employee Free Choice Act. That's old at this point. Hard for us to accept. That's 15 years ago. Our power has slipped tremendously since then. If we're going to talk about, quote, labor law reform, we're going to have to aim much higher because that kind of workplace by workplace bargaining that's most of my life, that kind of workplace by workplace organizing and bargaining is what I meant to say. We're not going to get to where we need to get the kind of economic transformation with black, brown, and white workers united. That's right, Marilyn. We'll get nowhere if we skip over that, as you pointed out. But we're not going to get to that place, workplace by workplace in this country. We know the numbers. 6.5% of the private sector has bargaining rights. You heard from Lauren, it was 35% when I was a kid growing up in North Philadelphia. And we're not going to get there even if we recreate a much better way to do that. And frankly, the political equation is exactly the same. If we unite and fight for something like the Employee Free Choice Act, by being in the streets, by having a broad movement, not by having just that one issue. We'll never get anything with one issue, as we heard. It's got to be a bunch of issues that together lead to a vision of the world that's worth fighting for and working for. But it's not to reproduce the Employee Free Choice Act, in my view. And this is a conversation that me and others are trying to get going everywhere. And interestingly enough, the teachers union, AFT, Randy herself, learning from West Virginia, are very much interested in getting this conversation going. Because it's hard to imagine why we would want to sign up, in the case of New Jersey, to have 567 different negotiations when all these things are off the table. It's also illegal to strike there, when instead we could talk about sectoral bargaining, and there'll still be other issues about right to strike and other things, where you actually bargain with the governor and the state legislature. That's what you saw in West Virginia. But it's not mainly the public sector. This is mainly about the private sector. Let's imagine that we had sectoral bargaining for those bank workers who've been organizing for years now. Let's imagine that we had that, and all the banks had to be at the table with the representatives of, and it could be more than one union, of the unions. This is what goes on again in most of the world that has collective bargaining coverage at 50, 60, 70%. We're not talking about union membership. We're talking about collective bargaining coverage. And so what happens? The organizing in these countries becomes more like our internal organizing, because the employers know they're going to have to be there one way or the other. They can't shut the door down on bargaining rights. Bargaining rights are part of the political rights of those democracies. And in my view, and what I've written about here, and what I look forward to talking more about, if we don't think more like that, and we continue to just think that it's about find the resources to organize, which, you know, our union will continue to do, and many unions here will continue to do. Without that offense, we'll never get any of this. Without those examples, we won't get any of this. Without that inspiration, we won't get any of this. But if we couple that inspiration that we get, whether it's Red for Ed or any of these other fights that are going on right here in New York City, incredibly inspiring stories. Fast food would be another example of this. Many, many stories like this. Without those stories, we won't have the examples to build the kind of a movement of millions and millions of Americans that says, we're going to change this country. We're going to tackle the rules that have blocked us deliberately from the time of the original Constitution. It's tough to say that, but we better get there. A Constitution based as much on slavery as democracy, as much on private property as on common good. And changing the rules, a whole bunch of them, are going to have to be what we fight for, even if the only thing we care about, which it's not, would be that, damn it, why can't workers in this country go to work, have some rights, and be able to make a difference in terms of the lives of their families and their communities? And most of all, we have to believe, and I said this all the time in the Bernie campaign, we must believe that we can win. We must say it together, loudly. We believe that we can win. We believe that we can win. We believe that we can win. Thank you.